Sharmeen Narwani, thank you so much for joining us on Insight. You are the editor-in-chief and columnist of the Cradle online magazine, which focuses on the geopolitics of West Asia, and you recently launched the Arabic language edition. I'm very happy that we're able to do this have this conversation. I follow your publication, and there are a lot of excellent analysis and articles and news items in there. Always, a good place for people to go to if they want to know what's going on in West Asia. And so we're going to take this opportunity in this conversation to look at a more broad analysis make a more broad analysis of what's happening in West Asia. There's a lot of interesting things happening. Your publication also talks about the new year, 2023. You have some of your columnists and your contributors making predictions, making some analysis. So we can start wherever you want. I can suggest, if you like, with your permission, we start with the very interesting article that you had in your publication related to the way in which the Americans are basically blackmailing Iraq, because in terms of the money that the oil money, the oil sales money that the Iraqis have to send to the U.S., and that the U.S. is basically, blackmailing the Iraqis. If you could give us a little insight into that story, and we can start there and go to other places later.
Well, there are quite a few countries in the region now that are experiencing severe economic downturns. And some of these are natural because governments have not planned ahead. Governments borrow money excessively, whether for the IMF or allies in the region and abroad. And they don't really have programs. There's a lot of corruption. So, but what's happening recently, I think in the last few years, is an escalation of the sanctions tool, the U.S. sanctions tool, to bring even allies into line with U.S. policy ambitions in the region. And the most recent, Turkey's experienced this, for instance, a NATO ally. But most recently, we're seeing this in Iraq. And what happened recently is that about 19 Iraqi banks were sanctioned. That decreased the central bank sales of dollars by about 40%, which led to a huge decline in supply and a huge decline in the ability for banks to transfer dollars. You would have to wait a minimum of 15 days now to transfer dollars anywhere. Part of this was to get a handle on the dollars that were moving in the Iraqi market, particularly outside of Iraq, to countries like Iran, Syria, and Lebanon. So these particular screws that were put on Iraq specify Lebanon as one of those target countries where dollars are being contained. But I think this article that we wrote it went viral. I think even Iraqi journalists, we don't see a lot of light shining on issues that are of huge importance to the economic independence and political independence of the country. It seems like Iraqi politicians themselves, no matter what side, do not want to discuss the nitty-gritty. And an example of this is that our article shines a light on the fact that since 2003, the U.S. invasion and occupation of Iraq, all Iraqi oil revenues must be sent to a single bank account in the United States, okay? Not multiple, not dollar accounts in Singapore or Europe or anywhere. One single bank account in the United States. This is by the occupying and invading entity. And all these years later, exactly 20 years later, this practice continues. And this is a key point of leverage that the Americans continue to exercise over all Iraqi political decisions. If you don't do this, we will not release your oil revenue, dollar supply in our bank, right? But this is something like, you're hard pressed to find Iraqi politicians, again, on both sides of the political aisle, or all sides of the political spectrum to address this very critical issue. How can Iraq use its dollars, use its oil revenues to invest in infrastructure, key infrastructure that is severely affecting the population, like access to water, electricity, et cetera. We've seen protests about these kind of things. How can they do that when they don't control their revenues? So I think this is a very important thing, and we hope at the Cradle in the next few weeks and months to delve deeper into the subject and try to get Iraqi politicians on the record about, and this issue on the table in Iraq. Why is our money there, and how do we diversify it so that we have control over our revenues?
That's very interesting you mentioned that, because everybody probably remembers that during the sanctions before the American invasion, there was the famous oil for food program, which didn't really do much for the Iraqis even at that time. But it seems that this is just a continuation of that. And then, of course, we have that famous photograph of Senator Tom Cotton, who was an American officer in the Iraq War, sitting on this pile of gold bars from the Iraqi central bank, which apparently, this was reported at that time. I haven't seen any reporting after that. But at that time, it was reported that basically all the gold reserves were shipped off to Canada after the invasion. So it seems that this whole occupation that the Americans had was very much that old school mercantilist, colonialist, imperialist strategy: get the oil, get the gold, and not really caring about other things. And so it seems that maybe Iraq, until this is solved, until this is resolved in some way, is not going to be able to be a normal country and deal with other countries, as we've seen, for example, with some of the cases that it had with Iran. Is there anything else you might want to add to that?
I think what's happening is very critical here, because, this has been going on for absolute decades. It's not a recent thing, but there has always been Western efforts to shutter the borders between Iran and Iraq, between Iraq and Syria, between Syria and Lebanon. And that continues. You actually have U.S. troops stationed at the Syrian-Iraqi border to inhibit the flow of goods and, transportation vehicles and whatever for the last number of years.
We just had that recent attack on the Iranian convoy that was sending, diapers and the gloves, the sanitary gloves.
Yes. And we have a new Iraqi Prime Minister Soudani, and he comes in as a nominee of the more pro-Iran elements of the Iraqi body politic. And so he's an unknown factor. The previous Prime Minister, Mustafa al-Kadhimi, was pretty much, towed the American line on all things. Prior to him, you had Adel Abdel Mahdi. And he was very interesting because he was doing some unusual things in Iraq around just before the October protests broke out in 2019, and basically, scuttled all political movement, development, economic, political, movements, et cetera. And one of the things he did was open officially the Iraqi-Syrian border.
That's right.
The other thing he did was he signed an agreement with the Chinese, basically an oil for infrastructure deal, and a couple of other things like that within a short space of time, which absolutely, raised all kinds of alarms for the Americans. And then within no time, you had the October protests. And this is how they do. They can create domestic strife in countries. They can sanction entities. They can use financial tools to destabilize the national currency. They can set off a fire or a bomb here and there. But to me, it seems that these are the only tools left in the U.S. policy toolbox. They are not going to engage in a war or fan the flames towards a war because they cannot afford this. Their sights are firmly set on the Russian theater,
Right.
with the Chinese one not far behind. I mean, many American policymakers argue that China's number one, why are we wasting our time on Russia? And then there are those who take a flip view. But for right now, West Asia can pretty much assure itself that there's not going to be any major hot war in the region, but we are going to have plenty of troubling instigation, sabotage,
right.
Efforts to buy off people and to sway perceptions, that kind of thing. But the toolbox is very small these days for the Americans. But I think Iraq is a perfect example of a recently targeted state, and it comes as a warning to Soudani, who, as I said, was it was a nominee from the sort of a pro-Iran coalition in Iraq, right. To not rock the boat too much. And sure enough, Soudani made a statement about a week or two ago saying he's not troubled by U.S. troops stationed in the country, et cetera, which I didn't take very seriously because his role ultimately is to balance Iran and the U.S., which is unfortunate because an Iraqi prime minister's role should not be to balance these two countries.
Right. Exactly.
It should be to pave a pathway for Iraq's economic development.
What are Iraq's national interests? That should be the focus.
I mean, in Iraq, in Lebanon, they're treading water.
Right.
And I mean, there's a point to that. I don't particularly think much of the slow bloodletting that happens.
Right.
These sanctions on Syria are absolutely oppressive, on Iran, now on Iraq, on Turkey, Egypt's economy. Why are we all treading water instead of carving a new path together?
Well, it's very interesting you mentioned that, because it seems to me that what you're talking about is really a problem of the elites of those countries, not having the power to be able to define their own national interests. Of course, Iran, the big exception in this case, having a revolution, having an independent system of governance, no matter what one might want to criticize, and there are things to criticize about Iran, but it is an independent country. It makes its own decisions based on its national interest. So you mentioned Egypt. There's a lot to talk about Iraq. We could go on for the whole program, so let's move to Egypt. You were talking about how a lot of the economies in the region are experiencing problems, and of course Egypt is maybe experiencing the worst economic crisis in a very long time. There was this very secret, under the radar, your publication reported about it, this very secretive, under the radar summit of leaders of some Arab countries in the Emirates, of course without the presence of the Saudis and the Kuwaitis. And it seems the King of Jordan was there, the Egyptian leadership was there, and it seems that the main focus was trying to basically, save Egypt from this social economic catastrophe that's looming there. If you could please, share some insight into this issue with us.
Well, the columnist Abdelbari Atwan, who wrote that
very
piece,
famous columnist.
He's wonderful. He didn't know the answers to why there was an emergency summit called for the next day that required the attendance of heads of states. Not only heads of states of Egypt and Jordan, but of 4 of the GCC countries. So he had to analyze what potentially was the subject under discussion and came up with 2 things. One was, King Abdullah flew over and suddenly you had this meeting. So what that could suggest, for instance, is because in Egypt the previous day, the meeting included the Palestinian head of state. King Abdullah had been
King Abdullah of Jordan.
King Abdullah of Jordan had been attending a meeting that included Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas.
Correct.
And we know recently there has been a lot of concern about the status of Jerusalem and the new right-wing Israeli government's efforts to depopulate Jerusalem of Palestinian residents and to also, attack Al-Aqsa Mosque and potentially destroy it. So And King Abdullah of Jordan has voiced significant concern because he is viewed as the custodian of the Al-Aqsa Mosque and Jerusalem,
Right.
and fears that that status is about to be taken out from under him. So that was one potential topic of discussion, and the other one was Egypt's economy. I mean, we're talking about the entire collapse of the state, the inability for Egypt to address the most basic services in its country. And the IMF has said that Egypt needs $40 billion in immediate aid. Otherwise, the state's collapse is imminent and inevitable. So, traditionally, Egypt, I think since the beginning of the Arab Spring, has taken in financial assistance from Persian Gulf countries of a much larger amount than 40 billion. But Persian Gulf countries recently, and perhaps this is why the Saudis and Kuwaitis didn't attend, the Kuwaiti parliament took a decision not to give Egypt any more aid. And the Saudis have now announced, I think we heard at Davos recently, that there will be no unconditional aid anymore to anyone, okay? So, so I think these were two potential topics under discussion at the secretive meeting in Abu Dhabi. But, I don't know if this was such an important meeting after all. There are these kind of meetings that are taking place all the time. There's a lot of troubleshooting going on in this region. There are a lot of plans afoot, and there are a lot of shifting alliances, and this is what's important, not just between regional states, but between great powers and the region. So we see in the Persian Gulf, for instance, now the Saudis and Emiratis, who are the key players in the GCC, the key decision makers and drivers of GCC policy, stepping up their relations with China and Russia, and brushing off American attempts to force them into oil pricing and oil production that doesn't benefit these countries. So we're seeing more independent foreign policies emerge under the younger leadership of, in the GCC. And so there's no enmity. They're not taking sides between the U.S. and Russia and China now. They're exploiting all opportunities. They're being opportunistic, which is how politics should be, in a way. You do what benefits you. But then regionally, of course, you have crazy shuttle diplomacy taking place for the last few years. The Turks, after being fully isolated in the region, and this comes a mere 10 years after being absolutely lauded by Arab leaders in the region for its policies and its good neighborliness, have realized, having realized how isolated they were, have ventured to try to reopen relations with Egypt and with the UAE and others in the region, and the Saudis. And the Saudi and Iranian rapprochement, for instance, and the Emiratis and the Iranians, and the Qataris and the Iranians, and it goes on, and the Qataris within the GCC, and of course Turkey with Syria. So we're seeing a lot of troubleshooting going on in shuttle diplomacy. The question is, will it arrive at anything? And when it does, what are the alliances going to look like in the region? What are the things that will drive these alliances? It usually is for something, economy, for instance, or geopolitical play, and these can shift very easily because, if you look at any of these countries, you will have a domestic reasons for making decisions, and then you will have regional ones, and then you have international ones. So I see in this year a lot of shifts depending on things that rise in the region. But I think everyone's keeping doors open now because they have learned that closing doors is not leading anyone in this region to a better place.
Right. So it seems to me that the overarching title of this could be just the fact that American hegemony is kind of on the decline. that that there's a feeling among those who were maybe the closest allies of the U.S. that the U.S. can no longer support their family rule the way it used to in this unconditional way. We saw, for example, the way that the Yemenis were able to really pound the Saudis in a way that nobody expected. And there were at times when you literally had the Yemenis striking back deep into Saudi territory. And of course, the Americans not doing anything about it. So let's talk a little bit about this changing, what the Saudis really are after. It seems to me it's always about the Al Saud. It's always about keeping the Saudi family in power. You know, we have these, things that they do. They allow Halloween and they allow pop concerts so that the young people don't, God forbid the young people should ask for, a elected government there, or somehow the Al Saud not being able to, no longer ruling there, having actually an elected government of some form there. So let's talk about this idea that the Saudis are attempting to, the Al Saud are attempting to kind of, continue their dictatorial rule, but maybe this time with the support of the Chinese or with some other country. And how feasible is that really? Because if we see their whole rule was based on the Americans really, bringing them to power and keeping them in power.
Well, many states come into being for a reason, but then after generations, take a life of their own, create their own reasons to be, reasons to exist. I always think of Jordan during the reign of King Hussein. Jordan is not resource rich. Its main resource is its human resource, which it generously lends out to Gulf countries and other countries in the region. So he had to make this state, Jordan, which had no relevance and no real borders, before established by imperial powers and colonial powers, relevant. And so King Hussein made Jordan relevant by being a mediator to all. And King Abdullah, his son, has shut the door on that by basically having relations with only one side. What is Jordan's relevance today except being a buffer state? I would argue that obviously the Saudis and the Emiratis and Gulf countries, because of their natural resources, have more longevity and reason to be for longer. What's interesting now is, as I mentioned earlier in the program, the younger generation coming in for the first time in a very long time. And this younger generation, what intrigues me sociologically about them is they did not grow up with absolute reverence and deference to the imperial power that established them. They went to schools, they went to Sandhurst, they went to Georgetown, they went to Western schools. They come, while extremely privileged, lived unusually privileged lives in those capitals, Western capitals. And, with it comes a certain arrogance. So they're not going to be like their fathers and grandfathers, ultimately knowing who pulls the strings. They have agendas of their own. And I think that, we're seeing this, for instance, in the Palestinian youth today. A generation has passed since the Oslo Agreement and the Madrid peace talks. And the parents of the younger generation emerging in the West Bank today were absolutely, deferential to the Oslo system, waiting for the rewards of that and following and, the system as it was designed to oppress Palestinians, but having Palestinians do instead of Israelis. So, we have another generation now that is turning conventional relationships on its head and maybe thinking differently about the future of their countries. So I don't see the Saudis disappearing overnight. I don't even think their sort of foes in the region, Iran, want to see that. Nobody wants a Wahhabi country with I don't know how many Patriot missiles and state-of-the-art military equipment to be disrupted from within. These are very dangerous scenarios. In almost any country you look like that have experienced these color revolutions and other kinds of internal disruptions, you have the falling apart of the state. You know, you have the spreading of small weapons, medium weapons, that kind of thing. Nobody wants a destabilized Saudi Arabia, you know. But I think that country is going to evolve like other countries have to in the region. For one, they fully understand that they cannot depend, as you said, on the Americans to help them out militarily, as was the case in Yemen when almost every Saudi city has been targeted by Ansar Allah missiles right now, and several UAE cities as well. And there was no Americans to the rescue. In fact, these countries watched the Iranians lob a dozen ballistic missiles into several US bases in Iraq without a reciprocal American reaction. They saw Iran shoot down an American state-of-the-art $200 million plus stealth drone without an American reaction. So they understand that the US is not going to come to anyone's assistance, which is why this younger generation is now diversifying its relations with rising powers like Russia and major economic powerhouses like China, right, who is demanding in turn that these countries participate in its ambitious multi-trillion-dollar Belt and Road Initiative, which fundamentally will upend Western shipping and transportation systems and mechanisms throughout the world. The Chinese are going to create land routes throughout all of Asia and into Europe that did not exist, train routes and waterway routes, as are the Russians. And, you know, the Iranians, the Pakistanis, a lot of Asian countries now are, you know, have now for a few years been actively pursuing these alternative routes, which, by the way, make shipping a lot cheaper, but right, importantly brings this valuable, important ability into their hands, into their national hands. You're not dependent on the Suez Canal. If Iraq, by the way, has launched a project, okay, a route that would cut the Suez route, and we have a map of this we created for our site yesterday, by significant amounts, which reduces costs, reduces the cost of shipping by 20 to 25 days. These
right. So it would be going into the southern coastal, in Basra, from Basra, yeah, and then up through Iraq.
Yeah.
That's very interesting because, you know, Iran has the Chabahar starting in Chabahar and going up through the Caspian region towards Russia, and very similar things. So let's talk about that, because you had very interesting reports about this idea that this is going to be, you know, transformative in ways that's, you know, historic, very significant strategically. So if you could give us a little bit more on that in terms of, you know, this area, West Asia, going back to what it was historically, this center of global trade, this center of global, you know, cooperation between East, West, North, and South.
Yeah, you know, this comes from, I mean, by the way, what you were mentioning about Iran and Russia and the route, this also heavily includes India.
That's right.
So, you know, and India, post the Ukraine war, has very openly warmed up to the Russians.
Right.
And put their foot down with the Americans on sanctions against Russia, on sanctions against Russian oil and gas, and said, no, this is not in our interest, we're going to move ahead. But importantly, the Iranians, Russians, and the Indians are leading this route initiative called the International North-South Transportation Corridor. And this drew the attention recently. I think it was Bloomberg or the Wall Street Journal that said the Iranians and the Russians have created a sanctions-busting route in which, you know, through which they can trade. But in fact, INSTIC has been around and in development for a long time. They conveniently left out that India is a major leader and driver of this project. And now you have, you know, direct capital-to-capital transportation route between these three countries. And these are all connecting. So it's not just China's BRI project, but there are a lot of players in the region, from Turkey to Azerbaijan to Iran to Russia to, who are Pakistan and China, CPAC,
Right.
who are creating these corridors that have been in development for a long time. We actually did an article, published an article by the former Austrian foreign minister, who is an oil and gas expert and a longtime diplomat, and really understands these transportation routes in a way that I don't think many European leaders do.
Right.
I mean, she said all routes, all pipelines are heading east. She said this a long time ago, and we're now seeing this. But she wrote about a route in the north of Russia because of global warming and melting of icebergs. Right. We now have the ability to circumvent all the main routes of European powers, to get goods and transport goods between continents, can now be circumvented very quickly and cheaply. So this is, I've argued that we've been in World War III since Syria. And
Right.
why do I say that? Really, there's no hysteria intended behind this language.
Right.
If you look at the world wars, there are several things that are absolutely part and parcel for World War. One is a major power standoff. In a sense, the Cold War was a world war. We just don't categorize it as that.
Because they didn't have a war between themselves, but the rest of the world was in war, in a situation of war, proxy war.
It was a major power standoff. But importantly, how do you characterize one kind of war as a world war and another not?
That's right.
Importantly, after a world war, you have a rejigging of global institutions.
Exactly.
Okay?
Yes.
And that's important. In Syria, we saw the BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and then South Africa as a later entrant, declare or produce a joint communique on foreign policy for the first time, which was in 2012.
Right.
And it was on Syria. Okay? So, we saw during this process a movement of, now it's being sped up, Russia and China and Iran, and others looking at alternative ways to message between banking systems.
That's right.
And to create alternative currencies and that are gold-backed or backed by a basket of currencies.
That's right.
All these things started then. We're only hearing about them now because the global war has advanced, the world war has advanced.
Would you also agree that also because the fact that the media, the global media, is so dominated by Western media, at that time when these things were happening, at the time when the U.S. and all its allies, with all their money and all their military might, were losing the war in Syria and lost the war in Syria to Iran, to Russia, to the resistance, to the Syrian army, that it was kind of not mentioned. It's like, okay, this major thing happened, there are these things happening, but let's not talk about it because it's not beneficial to the empire that media is serving.
Yeah, that's for sure. But I have to say, even resistance media does not do geopolitics very well. They don't know how to analyze. They don't do propaganda well. And when I say propaganda, I'm not talking about like videos overlaid with music showing battle scenes, okay? That's really bad propaganda. I mean, when I use propaganda in a positive sense, in that a government or a group is describing their value proposition to the masses, okay? So good propaganda would be for the Iranian people to understand what the Iranian government was doing in Syria, not be questioning it years later. I could have explained to the Iranian people what the Iranians were doing in Syria, that it was existentially important, that it was to stop terror. I mean, we could have explained this from year one.
That's right.
But still in year 9, many Iranians will ask, why are we spending money in Syria? And I have to explain the concept of strategic depth. America considers the entire world its strategic depth. Most countries consider their bordering states their strategic depth. And it doesn't mean strategic depth doesn't mean colonizing or, being an imperial power or forcing yourself on neighboring countries. It basically means establishing, solid enough relations that the neighboring country will never be used as a launching pad against you.
Exactly.
So this is why Iran can no longer rely on its borders. It has to have Iraq and Iraqi authorities secure the border from the Iraqi side. Do you understand? And it has to have Syria secure the border with Iraq, so you don't have this free flow of Salafi, Takfiri types into Iran. Exactly. Okay, so this is why Iran needed to be in Syria, because these Takfiris would only be heading eastward.
That's right. Okay. And the same on the eastern border with Afghanistan.
Yeah, and this is like a no-brainer. I mean, why were the Russians and Chinese in Syria? Now, many people will argue that the Chinese were not, in fact, an ally of Syria. I absolutely disagree, and I'll tell you why. First of all, they used a very important tool from time to time, which was the Security Council veto. They didn't always let Russia do it on their own, but that is a major play.
That's right.
At the Security Council, okay? The Russians didn't need to be on the ground for much of this conflict because Syria's Iranian allies, okay, and Hezbollah allies and various other militia allies were on the ground, okay? The Chinese didn't need to be in the air in Syria because the Russians took that role.
Exactly.
China had their back all the way because they understood fully. I mean, we know the propaganda about the Uyghur situation in China, for instance. Right. They understand fully that there are elements that would like to take that Western province away from China, stir up conflict there, make terrorism a daily thing in China. And the Russians understand in Dagestan, Chechnya, whatever, that the same target is there. So these countries were also fighting existential battles in Syria. Hence why I call it the first battlefield of World War III.
That's right.
Okay,
very
it's
nice.
Just now moved to the Ukraine. Okay, but it's been in various theaters. Some will not require major powers to be involved, like for instance in Venezuela. But the Russians are there, the Iranians are there, and of course the Chinese are making great efforts to do business with all of Latin America. Which the Americans cannot countenance because it's their backyard forever.
Right, exactly. Well, that's very interesting. I mean, I think you make a good case that we really did witness what at any other time in history would have been called a world war, and that, as you said, there's a new order being shaped after that.
Yeah.
That it's both institutionally, but also in terms of the balance of power that exists between the different powers that are there. And, it seems to me that we sometimes underplay the role that Iran had in this story. And of course, sitting in Tehran, I have to make the case for Iran's significance in this. As we saw, Iran was in Syria for 3 years before the Russians came. So as you mentioned, there was this understanding, this strategic understanding that happened at the highest level of the leadership in Iran. And of course, we had General Qasem Soleimani, taking charge of what was going on, and of course Martyr General Hamadani, who was the main commander at that time, the Iranian commander that was there. And I just want to suggest something to you, maybe based on what you were saying, that this lack of understanding of strategic depth. And I've done a lot of research in this particular question, and it seems to me it's a historic problem that we were taught not to think strategically. And it was something that the only people who are allowed to think strategically were the Americans or the British. Of course, maybe those of us like me and you who were able to get educated in that part of the world, that was part of our training, part of how we were taught to think strategically. But it seems to me that there's this idea that, strategic thinking is something for others to do and, not something that Iranians or people in West Asia should do. As you mentioned, it's even something within the resistance media and the people who are in favor of the resistance who have a very low understanding of these strategic affairs. If you could maybe talk about this idea that this might be actually a historic problem.
Well, I mean, I would have to disagree with you from the onset of that argument because
Okay.
Iran and chess, okay, you know, Iranians are viewed as stellar strategic players. There is nobody who would argue otherwise. I just think that is not translated to the general population.
Right.
The Iranian government does not propagate its value propositions and its, you know, its goals and its pathways to realize these goals very well.
So in other words,
maybe because they don't understand media. Okay?
Well,
and
let me understand what you're saying. So you're saying that on a strategic level, whether it's the leadership or governments, they actually do it very well. Yeah. They actually have that strategic understanding.
They do it very well, but when I come to Iran,
right.
I struggle to see who's making these decisions because I'm not meeting them.
Well, that's part of our trick, is nobody's supposed to know who's making the decision. But what you're saying is that this is not translated into a more general understanding, whether it's in the education system, whether it's in the media, that would then allow normal people in Iran who are not involved in these decisions to understand what's going on, contrary to maybe some other countries.
I mean, someone who does it well in this region is Hassan Nasrallah, the Secretary General of Hezbollah. He's on, you know, he's on television frequently, and you can hear a pin drop in Lebanon, you know, even in the homes of his opponents when he's speaking, because he makes the effort to describe what is going on and what Hezbollah's goal is in what is going on, and the fact that they will not participate in what's going on, and this is why, or we will participate in what's going on, and this is why, and this is how. Now, Iran is a nation, you know, it doesn't need to do that every day, whereas Hezbollah is, you know, represents a portion of Lebanese society, right? Right. So Iran and the Russians and Chinese, you could all say, are masters of strategic ambiguity. You know, what shocks me is how often the Americans thought, from Obama onwards, you know, and still think that they can temper Iran's behaviors by engaging with them in some kind of way. Iran does what it does because it's beneficial to Iran. Right. Period. Every country should act in that way. You don't sell out something that is beneficial to your country in order to make a deal somewhere else. You make a deal over something that is, you know, expendable, but not something that is fundamentally, you know, important to food security, national security, water security, things like that. So the Americans plod on. I mean, during the Syrian war, I mean, countless newspaper articles year after year on, like, will Putin drop Assad? You know, will Khamenei drop Assad? And so this is an important game. This is a important tactic that that Moscow, Beijing, and Tehran frequently use. But I will say that Iran does not do a sufficient job in explaining its value propositions, its strategic imperatives to the Iranian people. Khamenei does it, but not everyone listens to Khamenei. You do have large, maybe, you know, large numbers of Iranians who are not particularly religious, don't tune into these programs, but are opposed to U.S. sanctions, are opposed to U.S. imperialism, are opposed to the war that went on in Syria against Syria. One of the most interesting things about the resistance axis when I first started getting back into analysis and politics in 2009 was that it is Muslim, it is Christian, it is Sunni, it is Shia, it is religious, it is secular. You can be Druze, you can be Christian, you can be Turkish. Right. It's about a principle, okay, for independence, you know, carving out your own destiny, anti-imperialism, anti-Zionism, and most Iranians subscribe to that.
Right. Well, I would have to agree with you in the sense that when we saw what happened when General Soleimani was martyred, we really saw the real face of what Iran is, because as you may recall, and as everybody saw, this was, you know, it was everywhere in the world. The pictures were and the films were seen by everyone. You really had the vast majority of Iranians, you know, showing their grief about what was happening to somebody who was a national hero. Of course, he was
100%.
He was, of course, you know, from a particular part of society in terms of being religious and being from the revolutionary elite. Yeah. But we saw the fact that even today, until today, we recently, of course, had our very nice interview with his daughter, Zeynep Soleimani. People can check it out on the Press TV website, where she talks about the fact that, you know, this was something that, you know, nobody in the world really thought would happen in the way it did. Yeah. But I agree with you that in many ways, and again, I go back to my own understanding of this, having spent time in the media, in the university, and in the different public sphere in Iran, that it's a historic problem in Iran that Iranians are not supposed to think strategic, that doing this is somehow some, you know, sin that you have committed, because for so many years it was the Americans or the British, you know, controlling those strategic institutions in Iran, like the foreign ministry, like the planning and budget organization, which basically ran the country as a parallel cabinet, and the universities and the army. And it was really only, you know, 44 years ago when you had somebody like Imam Khomeini coming and reawakening that strategic heritage, which you pointed to very well, the fact that Iran has had this strategic thinking for millennia. Also very interesting, you might want to be interested to check that out. We had a very nice interview with the commander of the Iranian Navy, Admiral Irani. His name is actually Admiral Irani. He's a Kurd from Sanandaj. And he talked about the fact that Iran was a seafaring nation, but that this was a deliberate plan by the British to separate Iran from going into the sea. And of course now we have Iran going to the Panama Canal. So,
well, let me say something about that. I mean, this is where you do see Iran being very strategic, even though it's maybe not parlayed that way within Iran. And I interviewed an analyst, a very well-known analyst who's affiliated with the IRGC some years ago in Iran, and you know, he said, one of the things we've decided to do is emulate what the Americans do.
Right.
Okay, they go into every waterway. So we decided we can go into every waterway.
That's right.
Okay, and they said, the Americans say they're in the waterways to combat terrorism and piracy.
That's right.
Well, we're in the waterways to combat terrorism.
And we really are, as opposed to what the Americans say. And there was.
But that is a very strategic decision. It can't come overnight. It means Iran has to build up its naval capacity and capabilities. So I'm saying the Iranian government is chock full of strategic thinkers.
Very good.
I just don't generally meet them.
Right.
I don't know who they are.
That's good. Maybe that's good. Maybe we'll leave it at that.
And back to your point about Soleimani, you know, I think it was a poll in 2010. The University of Maryland does an biannual poll in Iran many, many years. And this one was really interesting because they did a popularity thing about like which Iranian political or, you know, personalities, major personalities, have favorability within the Iranian public. And Qasem Soleimani, I think, came in at 81 or 82%.
That's right.
In 2019.
Exactly.
He was a good 20 points ahead of the next most popular political person, who was Javad Zarif, who was followed very closely, ironically, by Ibrahim Raisi, who had become head of the judiciary in Iran. So he didn't win the old election, past election. But after becoming head of the judiciary, Iranians had thought this person they didn't know, was combating corruption, et cetera, very well. So, you know, it's important to look at what Iranians actually think. And for sure, secular Iranians embraced Qasem Soleimani, you know. But there should be more personalities in the Iranian government who can embrace a wider cross-section of the population who are not religious, Shia, and male, for instance, always. Right. Because you're losing your human resource, and we know that Ali Khamenei values the human resource.
Absolutely, he's the first person to talk about that, talking about having a maximum amount of people coming into the revolutionary fold. And again, we saw in the recent events, he talked about the fact that, we don't really, let's not talk about this idea that these ladies have bad hijab. There's no such thing as bad hijab. He talked about them having weak hijab, and that this is not related to them both being in terms of the religious fold and also being within the revolutionary fold. So I think it even goes back to what we saw with General Soleimani, basically going back to what the teachings of Imam Khomeini and Ayatollah Khamenei have been throughout these 44 years. We only have a few minutes left, Ms. Narwani. I want to get to where you are, which is Lebanon. If you could, very briefly, we only have a couple of minutes' time, give us your geostrategic analysis of what's going on in Lebanon and what we can look forward to. You already mentioned a little bit about Sayyid Hassan and the different things that go on there.
Lebanon is in a crisis situation, but this is what's so interesting. It's one of the reasons I feel more safe here than almost anywhere in the world. It's a country of about 5 million people, and it has mountains and seas and land, agricultural land. Like 5 million people can live off the land if need be. I mean, there's catastrophe happening everywhere. There's shortages happening everywhere. The other thing I've noticed from since I've been coming to Lebanon since 2009, and basing myself here for large portions of time, especially when I was covering the Syrian war, that whether you have a government or not, Lebanon seems to take on. And Lebanon is such a small state which is dependent on so many larger regional powers, not even international ones, but regional powers, that it seems to constantly be treading water, waiting for something to change in the region that can then, that Lebanon can benefit from. This is patently untrue. Lebanon has its own endemic problems. A very corrupt system of politics, very ridiculous electoral system.
That's right.
A central bank that is infected from top to bottom, who has catapulted the country into its biggest financial crisis ever, one of the biggest the world has ever seen, but is still not ejected because the Americans want him to stay. This is a man who is facing lawsuits in at least 5 European countries for embezzlement and corruption, but the Americans want him to stay. So it's a very, very difficult country to understand, and you will never understand it. We will at the cradle, however, when significant events happen, be the first to analyze them for you.
Very nice.
So do check in with the cradle from time to time if you want to know Lebanon.
Sharmeen Narwani, thank you so much for joining us on Insight. We've completely run out of time. Hopefully we can do this one more time. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sam. It was a pleasure being on your show.